And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this strong storm slowly weakening as it pushes in toward the north coast of the Panhandle there. So winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories for moderate to heavy snow continue for much of the area there, and continue to see dry conditions with mostly clear skies here. South central Alaska, maybe a few lingering flurries there in the Copper River Basin, mainly in along the mountains, light snow up in the upper Tanana Valley area, and also for the North Slope and the Arctic coast. But increasing winds here south and east of the Alaska Range down to the North Gulf Coast, including Kodiak Island. And the next system out to the west, bringing gale force winds and snow changing to rain into the western Aleutians. And then for the day on Thursday, that continues to push eastward and northeastward here, spreading some light snow and increasing winds of the Pribilofs late in the day. Otherwise, snow and rain pushing into the eastern Aleutians with temperatures in the 40s, or at least in the 30s, probably the floor 40s there for the Adak-Atka area with rain. Cold over all of interior Alaska, staying below zero west and north of the Alaska Range here all the way to the Arctic coast, with strong north winds and northeast winds here, Matanuska Valley, Resurrection Bay, Seward, and the normally windier areas here across the Copper River Basin to the Copper River Delta area, creating low wind chills, and colder and windier over the northern Panhandle as it dries out, but still a chance of some shower activity down to the south. This low backs out to the west a little bit. This one kicks off to the southeast, and then we'll see by Friday that whole mess drops out of the area there. That's getting ahead of myself there. That'd be day 3. Otherwise, for the south coast, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, east winds 30 knots here for the central coast, and northeast winds 20 to 30 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, small craft advisories, north winds 30 knots, probably some higher gusts there as well with 5-foot seas. North 25, gusts 40 knots, Stevens Passage, and southeast winds at 20 for Clarence Strait. And then for Thursday, south coast, east winds 25 knots, east winds 30 knots on the central coast, and north coast, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for Lynn Canal, north at 35 knots with seas at 12 feet, and north 25 knot winds for Stevens Passage, and east winds 20 knots with 8-foot seas there for Clarence Strait. And for Prince William Sound, north winds 30 knots for the day Wednesday with 7-foot seas. Good gales here for the western North Gulf Coast, anywhere up to 45 knots out of the north, northeast 45 knots there for the Barren Islands, northwest winds 45 to 50 knots for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, and Cook Inlet. Easy one, north winds 25 knots, seas 5 to 6 feet. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, look at that northeast winds 40 knots with gusts of 55 knots. Again, strong gusts coming out of the Copper River Delta areas. And for the day on Thursday, not much change here for Prince William Sound. Still looking at sustained northerly winds at 30 knots with definitely higher gusts out of the northern bays, seas at about 7 feet. North to northeast winds 30 to 45 knots there for the eastern North Gulf Coast. North 45 knots for the western North Gulf Coast with 8-foot seas. And Cook Inlet, still north winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas. And storm warnings for Kamishak Bay, northwest winds 50 knots, 45 knot northwest winds for the Barren Islands. And for the Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories for Wednesday, northwesterlies 25 to 30 knots, about the same in Bristol Bay there. Kodiak Island, gale warnings, northwest winds 40 to 55 knots. And then for Kodiak on Thursday, not much change. Northwest winds 40 knots with still some higher gusts going on. Winds starting to come down here, especially for the western Alaska Peninsula. Call it north to northwesterlies 20 to 25 knots. And for Bristol Bay, north winds 25 knots. And for the western Aleutians, starting to get the effects of that next system out here. So gale warnings back in the picture there from Kiska to Shemya, southeast 40 to 45 knots. Adak-Atka, southeast at about 20 knots. And the eastern Aleutians, west-northwest at 15 to 25 knots. Then for Thursday, southeast winds here for the Fox Islands at 30 knots with seas 6 to 8 feet. Adak-Atka, southeast 25 knot winds with 6 to 11 foot seas. and small craft advisories for the western Aleutians for southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Tomorrow for the Pribilofs, west winds 40 knots with higher gusts, north 20 knots for St. Matthew Island. Southwest coast, northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, northwest 15, St. Lawrence Island. And then the next day, pretty light winds now for the Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, north at 10 knots. North winds at 20 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Good gales though for St. Matthew Island, east winds 40 knots, east at 25 for the Pribilof Islands. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, so looking at gale force winds here out of the west, 35 knots there, Kaktovik to Demarcation Point, Barter Island, that area. Small craft advisories for the eastern Arctic coast, brisk wind advisories, west winds 25 knots. Central and western coast, west-southwest 15 knots in the Chukchi Sea, northwesterlies at 15 knots. And then for the day Thursday here, southeast to southwest winds at about 10 to 15 knots for the Chukchi Sea, western Arctic coast. South at 15, southwest 15 for the central coast, eastern coastline, west winds 20 to 30 knots.